Let's speak to the author of a best-selling new book all about the Chinese Communist Party and its actions over the last 2 years. Michael P Senger is the author of Snake Oil, How Xi Jinping Shut Down the World, and he joins me now. Great to have you on the show, Michael.
Thank you, Mark. Great to be here.
What are the headlines of your book?
So over the last 2 years, I've been researching and writing and mostly tweeting about the influence of the Chinese Communist Party on the response to COVID-19. And the results of that research over 2 years became the basis for my book, Snake Oil, How Xi Jinping Shut Down the World. And what my research reveals, what also ultimately comes out, is that the entire response to COVID-19 around the world was really one giant influence operation from the very beginning, with what we saw in early 2020 with those fear videos that came out of Wuhan, moving into all the propaganda that we started to hear around March 2020 with 2 weeks to slow the spread, follow the science, just stay home, those lockdowns in which the entire world suddenly copied what China claimed they had done in Wuhan to supposedly eliminate this virus in Wuhan. You have this domino effect where one country after another goes into lockdown, and everything after that was simply imported from what China said they had done in Wuhan. You find China's paw prints on every single aspect of the response to COVID-19 going all the way back to early 2020.
Yes, and of course the West pretty much discarded their own values in terms of how to govern a society, locking people down, inflicting a huge privation on their civil liberties and damaging the economy.
That's absolutely right. Absolutely horrifying. Now, if you think back to what we were experiencing in those dark days of early 2020, and especially in March 2020, if you're like me, I was not especially afraid of COVID-19 at that time. I've always been a big statistics person, and the early data actually coming out about the coronavirus at that time was not especially alarming, especially for people who were, not elderly, who were fairly healthy. But suddenly that didn't seem to matter. Suddenly, within a matter of just a couple weeks, we were told that, all of our rights were suspended. I woke up one day and suddenly all of my rights were gone. Just like that. What we knew about the virus didn't seem to matter. Not only did our knowledge about the virus not matter, but whoever had implemented this policy to suddenly shut down one country after another, across the entire world, had given absolutely no thought to what this meant for business owners, to what this meant for the poor, not only in the rich world. I don't think anybody will ever forget those scenes we saw of miles-long lines at food banks in the United States. In the United Kingdom, they say that 5% of the population of the United Kingdom, one of the wealthiest countries in the world, went hungry during strict lockdown. And then even worse, you saw what happened in the developing world. Suddenly, you have countries like India and South Africa locking down as well. You had this exodus of people just thrown out of work, forced to march to villages, just walk to villages thousands of miles away. They had absolutely no savings. Essentially, millions and millions of people were sentenced to starve, and many would perish, supposedly to protect from the super virus. Of course, we now know that those lockdowns did absolutely nothing to protect from this virus, and the virus is never that dangerous to begin with. But, those people cannot have their lives back. Millions were cast into extraordinary poverty, and whoever implemented this policy seemed to give no thought to that. And in fact, when you go back and you look at the pandemic plans, every single wealthy country around the world, the United States, the UK, each country in Europe has its own pandemic plan. And lockdown is not in those pandemic plans, nor is it in the World Health Organization's pandemic plans. Not only is it not in them, but if they do discuss it at all, they say absolutely do not do this. It is systematically excluded from those pandemic plans. There's no history of this policy of lockdown within the entire Western world since the Middle Ages at the very latest. It was all based on what Xi Jinping said he did in Wuhan in early 2020.
So do you think that this idea that the Chinese locked down to slow the spread of the virus was a lie? Was it a myth? Was it propaganda at the beginning of the pandemic?
That's all it was. Yeah, lockdown. The entire concept of lockdown is pure propaganda. Has no history in science, has no discussion within Western pandemic plans and Western epidemiology. It was simply one giant propaganda operation. And what we saw is that as soon as Wuhan locked down, on the very day that Xi Jinping announces this lockdown and throws, shuts millions of people in Wuhan into their homes, we start seeing all these propaganda videos, all these fear videos released all over the world, in the UK, the United States, websites, all of which are blocked in China. China is blocked off from the rest of the world's internet. But suddenly we see these videos going super viral. This all over social media sites, Facebook, Twitter. Facebook usually this happy, fun-loving place. Suddenly we're seeing all these videos, people just falling to their deaths, just piles of bodies in Wuhan, China, and everybody, having seizures, and just this idea that this super virus is coming to get you. Now, of course, a couple months later, every single one of these videos is proven to be fake. So all these faked videos set the stage for how the entire world perceived this virus that was supposedly coming.
So, Michael, are you suggesting that the Chinese Communist Party created the illusion that they were locking down in Wuhan in order to get the West to lock down? And if so, what was their motive?
The lockdown was real to a degree, but the motive really is exactly, as it's discussed in my book. It's about shutting down the world. It was about laundering this concept of lockdown into science, and to see how effective that was by shutting down this one medium-sized city within China of Wuhan. They got the entire world to follow them to lockdown. Shortly after that lockdown, the World Health Organization says, the Chinese Communist Party says that this had decreased their infection curve. Based on that alone, based on absolutely no precedent within science or epidemiology, based solely on what the Chinese Communist Party said, the World Health Organization, their representative to China tells the rest of the world in a press conference, you have to do this. What China has shown the world is that you have to do this. Copy China's response to COVID-19. They deny it now, but they said that in completely uncertain terms. And that's how this policy of lockdown was laundered into science all over the world, based solely on that and what the Chinese Communist Party had said. One country after another imports this policy in the hope that this will supposedly eliminate the virus. Of course, we now know that was complete nonsense.
Was this ultimately, in your view, a scorched earth policy by the Chinese Communist Party on the rest of the world?
There's no question that the Chinese Communist Party profited from this in a number of ways. Chinese billionaires made a ton of money by selling PPE and testing equipment to the rest of the world. So there's a short-term profit. Also, certainly in crippling the rest of the world, crippling the free economy of the free world. The GDP of every G20 country outside of China fell dramatically in 2020, just a huge, impact on the rest of the world's economy. However, China actually grew. China was not really very impacted by this. The other goal here was more long-term. Lockdown is a very totalitarian policy. This idea that you can just have this blanket suspension of people's rights, telling them just stay home, when that actually means, you lose your job, you lose your business, you have no more rights suddenly. That is a very totalitarian policy. And there's using this shock, using this fear in early 2020, that was a very quick way to implement, export that totalitarian policy around the world. And we're still living with that degree of totalitarianism today. The other thing this did is that lockdown, because there was so much buy-in to this lockdown policy among the elite class, among the political class, that implanted this seed, this idea of a super virus that we're still living with today. This idea that there's this super virus that you can only defeat through Chinese totalitarianism. The idea that the Chinese were able to eliminate this. And some people still stick by that big lie today, the idea that just by shutting down Wuhan for a few weeks, that China, with their super lockdown, where they welded people in, that was the secret, that their lockdown was so strict that they were able to eliminate this virus because they welded people into their homes. And of course, they had all these other strict policies and these quarantine camps and everything. And it turns out that every single policy, not just those initial lockdowns, but every policy that came after that, from mass testing to masks to vaccine passes, obviously, all of those policies are simply imported from what China says they did in Wuhan. That when you look at the pandemic plans that countries developed after those initial months of 2020, all these policies come straight from China. The idea of this, oh, okay, this works so well in China that we're going to do it here. None of these policies have any real history in science. They're all just imported from what China claims it did in Wuhan, using their influence, using the propaganda and influence within scientific and elite institutions.
Michael P Senger, has China already won? Is it game over for the West?
Thank you so much, Mark. No, I don't think this is game over. I don't think the Chinese Communist Party understood the amount of resistance they would get to all this. I really think it was this idea of shutting down the world. Shutting down the world is no small feat. So, I mean, the fact that they were able to pull that off is pretty, darkly incredible. However, what we've seen is that in countries across the world, that especially just in the last few weeks, that these COVID mandates have really been rolled back, that this idea suddenly evaporated. That countries are starting to lift their vaccine passes. In the United Kingdom lifted virtually all of its COVID mandates very recently, and that's really thanks in no small part to the resistance that we've seen, the civic resistance, both online and in protests in the real world, and just in the mainstream discourse, that people have really decided, wait a minute, these things don't work. Each of these policies, from the lockdowns to the mass testing, the vaccine passes, the masks, they are completely ineffective in slowing the spread of a respiratory virus. What do? They seed the idea that there is this pandemic out there. They are made to be self-perpetuating. But fortunately, enough of the public caught on to this scam, and it has really been rolled back. And, fingers crossed, hopefully it does not really come back in a big way.
Michael Lembit-Opik is a former British MP in the House of Commons. Lembit, what's your view?
Well, I should also declare an interest. It'll interest Leo to know I was the deputy chair of the all-party China group when I was in Parliament, and I spent time there. And before that, I worked for Procter & Gamble briefly in Guangzhou.
Did you take Chinese money as well as Russian rubles?
Yes, Beijing Barry.
I will take your
Mark
comment.
said it, not me.
Lembit, no wonder you retired at the age of 50.
No, I was retired at the age of 45 by my constituents, but that's another story. Michael, I agree with you in one sense, and interested to know what you think about this. China's playing a great strategic game, it seems to me. They've bought up half of Africa, and they make a lot of what we buy here. But surely, Michael, it's not China that's doing it to us. It's us doing it to ourselves. We've exported our manufacturing and all of our pollution as well, or all of that pollution. Then we blame China for having pollution.
Correct.
We have a very confused attitude towards China where we condemn them, but then we're totally dependent on them for much of what we make. And in terms of the lockdown, Michael, surely we did it to ourselves because China didn't tell us to lock down. We just made those guesswork judgments for ourselves. So is it not possible to argue that China saw the opportunity and they presented us with the chance to trip up, but we did the falling for ourselves?
Well, I think that's an excellent point, and that's definitely an excellent question. But I think it boils down to what the Chinese Communist Party actually is, especially in the modern world. Yeah, in a lot of ways, the West did do this to itself. There's a huge groupthink aspect to this, but that's because of the influence that China has been able to build up over the past several decades. This story does not begin just in 2020. It goes all the way back to when Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger reopened the West to China back in the 1970s. And ever since then, the Chinese Communist Party has very gradually been building up its influence, especially within elite institutions across the Western world. And just using that influence, and this is how communist influence has always worked historically, going all the way back to Stalin's regime and the way that they dominated Eastern Europe, going all the way back to the history of the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese Civil War. The Chinese Communist Party rules by conspiracy. It only takes a very small, tiny number of very evil people embedded within elite institutions and their mastery of propaganda, which is what they used to gain power and take control of China, even going all the way back there. And we let them in the door ourselves.
Could I just ask one very short additional question? You used the word evil there. I never felt that the Chinese were lying to me or trying to deceive me when I was in Guangzhou or indeed in Hong Kong. They told us what they were going to do, and they're doing it. So surely they're they're just wanting what we have in terms of influence and standard of living. And you can't really blame them for taking the opportunity we've given them.
The Chinese Communist Party is evil. Their history of human rights abuses and genocide and oppression is just, absolutely unbelievable. The number of lives that have been destroyed by the Chinese Communist Party, it's really immeasurable. We have no grasp of it within the free world, thankfully, within the Western world. And it was definitely our mistake in many ways to let that into our own system, because our systems have become so intertwined. Our elite institutions have become so intertwined. Our universities, think tanks, corporations have slowly become entangled with the Chinese Communist Party. And this machine, we have let it in. And we really saw that kicked into overdrive in 2020, because what happened with Xi Jinping is before that, you had China's moderate leaders who this influence network was expanding. It was very, very gradually, not noticeably. But in 2020, Xi Jinping, being the brutal dictator that he is, kicks us into overdrive. And with lockdowns, we saw communist influence across the world kicked into its highest gear. That this policy was very quickly laundered into policy, and using propaganda, they essentially steamroll Western leaders into embracing this policy of lockdown. And once they did that, they couldn't go back, because they had attached their entire ego to this idea of the super virus, that once you had, destroyed the entire economy in the hopes of slowing the spread, it's very, very difficult for people to admit that they had made such an egregious mistake with the lives of others.
Michael,
and not only that, but there's a massive group that aspect to it.
Yeah, Michael, we could obviously talk to you for hours. The clock's against us. Briefly, if you can, I've had a couple of emails saying, look, they hear what you're saying about what China were doing when they sort of, in your view, confected this drama around the virus. But one email in particular, Andrew said, look, how many Western medics and scientists could be that stupid to roll out a policy that they knew to be wrong? So how do we answer that? Why did the West go for this? Some of the greatest scientific minds in the world.
These are absolutely excellent questions. And the answer is that this is how the Chinese Communist Party has always worked. Going back, they have a century of experience with this. I encourage those. That's actually the most fascinating part of the story, most darkly fascinating part of the story, is the conduits of this propaganda operation, the linguistic elements to it, and how they use modern technology to get intelligent people to buy into this absurdity, because that's what the Chinese Communist Party does. It convinces intelligent people of absurdities. And seeing elites around the world, elites, I think, tend to be a bit egotistical. And they think that they're immune to propaganda. Propaganda is for little people. But when they see everyone around them embracing this lie that the Chinese Communist Party eliminated this virus with their super lockdown by welding people in.
But briefly, Michael, what about the scenes? What about the scenes in northern Italy, in India, in Spain, as pointed out by my viewer Andrew? They weren't fake, were they?
Now, some of that might just be the media, this is the big story, we're going to sow this fear because that's what's selling. But some of that could have been deliberate as well. That Italy was the first country in Europe to buy into the Belt and Road Initiative. You had a massive propaganda operation coming from China, focused very heavily on Italy, centered very heavily on Italy within those first couple months. The political party that was in charge of Italy at that time was very China-friendly political party. Frankly, a lot of what we saw coming out of Italy at that time was propaganda.
Okay, well, that's very interesting. Michael, sorry to interrupt, but the clock is against us. Sophie, an interesting point there from Michael P Senger. The propagandists in China essentially tricked the West, and therefore our own scientists and top medics basically visited that propaganda onto us, like a domino effect, Sophie.
Both of you are actually right in what you're saying, because there is no doubt that China have already defeated the West. They did it a long time ago. They're embedded into our universities, into our parliament, courtesy of Beijing Barry. But also, Lembit is right that the reason why they've been able to do that is because the West ourselves have been so deeply incompetent. I mean, China unleashed this virus onto the world. And this virus is China's fault. There is no question about that. So why on earth did we then go and copy their style of lockdown? Why did we then go and spend millions buying Chinese masks, Chinese LFTs? what we effectively did was we propped up their economy while our own economy shattered.
What a brilliant...
Therefore, the goal, the difference, the gap between the nations
Amazing.
has
Brilliant summing up.